Look at your feet. Whatever is on them right now, sneakers, boots, sandals, slippers, whatever it is, take it off for a second. Actually take it off. Feel the floor. Now imagine that is every surface you will ever walk on for the rest of your life. Gravel, frozen mud, sun-baked rock, thorns, the bathroom floor at a gas station. That is the world without shoes. And for roughly 99% of human existence, that is exactly how we lived. Barefoot. Every step, every hunt, every migration across a continent on bare skin. The human foot is a genuinely remarkable piece of engineering. 26 bones, 33 joints, over 100 muscles, tendons, and ligaments, all working together to let you walk upright on two legs, something almost no other animal on Earth does full-time. But there is a limit to what skin and bone can handle. And somewhere, tens of thousands of years ago, someone looked down at their bloody, cracked, frozen feet and thought, there has to be something I can put on these. That thought, that quiet little moment of problem solving, eventually led to a $400 billion global industry. But it started with a piece of dead animal wrapped around a foot. And the story between those 2 points is stranger, longer, and more consequential than you would expect. So when did humans first put something on their feet? Here's the problem with that question. Shoes rot, leather decays, plant fibers disintegrate. Unlike stone tools, which can sit in the ground for 2 million years looking roughly the same, the materials people used to make the earliest shoes simply do not survive. So we cannot point at the first shoe and say, here it is. What we can do is look at the bones of the people who wore them. In 2005, physical anthropologist Eric Trinkhaus at Washington University in St. Louis published a study that changed the timeline. He examined the toe bones of early modern humans and Neanderthals across multiple sites in Eurasia and noticed something. Humans living during the Middle Paleolithic, roughly 100,000 to 40,000 years ago, had thick, robust lesser toes, the 4 smaller toes on each foot. Their feet were built for gripping the ground, but humans from the Upper Paleolithic, starting around 40,000 to 26,000 years ago, had noticeably thinner, weaker, lesser toes, even though their leg bones were just as strong. The legs were still doing heavy work. The toes were not. Think about what that means. When you walk barefoot, your toes grip and flex against the ground with every step. That constant mechanical stress builds thick, strong toe bones over a lifetime. But if you put a rigid sole between your foot and the ground, the toes stop working so hard. They get weaker, thinner. Trinkhaus compared the foot bones of historically barefoot populations, like early Native Americans, with populations known for wearing heavy footwear like the Inuit, and found the same pattern. Thick toes in barefoot walkers, thin toes in shoe wearers. The bones told the story, his conclusion. Humans were regularly wearing some form of supportive footwear by at least 40,000 years ago, possibly earlier. That is not the Neolithic. That is not the Bronze Age. That is the middle of the Ice Age. People were wrapping their feet in something before they painted the caves at Lascaux, before they carved the first Venus figurines, before they crossed into the Americas. The shoe is older than almost every other surviving human technology, and we know this not because we found the shoe, but because we found what the shoe did to the foot. But here's the thing. While that skeletal evidence gives us a start date, the oldest shoes we can actually hold in our hands are much younger. The oldest directly dated footwear in the world are the Fort Rock sandals from Oregon. In 1938, archaeologist Luther Cressman of the University of Oregon was excavating Fort Rock Cave in the high desert of central Oregon when he found dozens of woven sandals buried beneath a layer of volcanic ash. That ash came from the eruption of Mount Mazama, roughly 7,600 years ago, the same eruption that created Crater Lake. The sandals were underneath it, which meant they were older. Radiocarbon dating later placed them between 10,500 and 9,300 years old. They are made of shredded sagebrush bark, twisted and twined into flat soles with a covered toe flap. Not exactly Nike, but they are sophisticated. The twining technique, where pairs of fiber wefts are twisted around passive warps, requires planning, coordination, and a material knowledge that does not happen by accident. Somebody in the Great Basin 10,000 years ago sat down, stripped bark off a sagebrush plant, and wove a shoe. And they did it well enough that it survived under volcanic ash for 100 centuries. But the sandals, impressive as they are, only tell part of the story. Because parallel to sandals in colder climates, another type of shoe was being invented independently. not an open woven foot covering, a closed, insulating leather enclosure. And the oldest surviving example of that is the Areni 1 shoe. In 2008, an international team led by Boris Gasparian of the Institute of Archaeology and Ethnography of Armenia, Ron Pinhasi of University College Cork, and Gregory Oreshian of UCLA was excavating the Arena 1 cave in the Vyotzor province of Armenia. In a shallow plastered pit beneath an overturned ceramic bowl, they found a single shoe, one piece of cowhide shaped around a foot, laced with a leather cord through eyelets cut into the edges and stuffed with grass. Radiocarbon dating placed it between 3,600 and 3,500 BC, roughly 5,500 years old, the oldest leather shoe on Earth. And here is the detail that tells you something about the care that went into this object. The shoe was not just a piece of leather folded in half. It was cut to a specific shape, fitted to the wearer's right foot, and the lacing system was functional, designed to pull the leather snug. The grass stuffing was probably insulation, or possibly a shaping material to keep the shoe's form when it was not being worn. This is not someone hastily wrapping leather around a foot. This is shoemaking. And the design is so similar to the pamputis once worn in the Aran Islands of Ireland and the opanki of the Balkans that researchers concluded this style of construction persisted, essentially unchanged, for millennia across a vast geographic range. Same shoe, different centuries, different continents. Now, if you want to see what shoe technology looked like at its peak in the prehistoric world, you look at a dead man found in the Alps. In 1991, two German hikers stumbled across a body melting out of a glacier near the Austrian-Italian border. That body turned out to be roughly 5,300 years old. They named him Otzi, and his shoes were, by any measure, a masterpiece. The outer sole was brown bearskin, chosen for durability and grip. The upper was deerskin, softer and more flexible. Inside, an inner netting of linden tree bark fibers held the structure together and contained the insulation, which was stuffed hay packed around the foot for warmth. The laces and bindings were strips of cowhide, and beneath the sole, additional cowhide strips were attached for traction on ice and rock. The leather had been tanned using animal fats, probably a mixture of brains and liver, then lightly smoke-dried to preserve it. 5 different animal and plant materials, at least 3 different construction techniques, assembled into a single functional unit designed to keep a human foot warm, dry, and intact at high altitude in freezing conditions. Researcher Petr Hlavacek built replicas and tested them in the Alps. They worked. No blisters, comfortable and dry at temperatures between -5 and -10 degrees Celsius. A 5,300-year-old boot designed by someone who had never seen a written word, outperformed a lot of what you could buy in a modern sporting goods store. Think about that the next time you spend $200 on hiking boots. Now here's where the story takes a turn. Because for tens of thousands of years, shoes were about survival, protection from cold, protection from sharp terrain, protection from the basic hostility of the ground beneath your feet. And then, somewhere around 3000 BC, shoes stopped being only about protection. They became about power. In ancient Egypt, most people went barefoot. Sandals made from papyrus, palm leaves, or woven grass existed, but they were not everyday wear for ordinary Egyptians. For the elite, however, sandals were markers of status. When Howard Carter opened the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922, he found 80 pairs of sandals. 80. Some were simple papyrus, some were elaborate leather with painted designs. And on the mummy itself, resting on the feet of the dead king, were sandals made of solid gold. They were shaped to look like woven reed sandals, every detail of the weave reproduced in metal, but they were never meant for walking. They were for eternity. And then there were the ones with pictures of enemies painted on the insoles, bound captives, depicted underfoot, so that with every step the pharaoh would symbolically trample the people he had conquered. That is not footwear. That is political propaganda you can wear. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Mediterranean, the Romans were turning shoes into an industrial-scale operation. And their military footwear might be the most functionally brilliant shoe design in the ancient world. The caliga was the standard-issue boot of the Roman legionary. Open lattice design cut from a single piece of leather, with a thick sole studded with iron hobnails, sometimes 100 or more per shoe. The open lattice prevented blisters on long marches by allowing air to circulate. The hobnails provided traction on stone, mud, and grass, and also served as a crude weapon in close combat. A Roman soldier who kicked you was kicking you with iron. And the distinctive sound of hobnailed sandals on stone became the audio signature of the Roman military presence. You heard the caligay before you saw the army. At Vindolanda, a Roman fort on Hadrian's Wall in northern England, archaeologists have pulled nearly 5,000 leather shoes out of the waterlogged soil. 5,000 baby booties, women's slippers with decorative cutwork, heavy military boots, bath clogs with wooden soles. The entire demographic life of a Roman frontier community preserved in footwear. Before those shoes were found, most historians assumed that remote frontier forts were populated entirely by soldiers. The shoes proved that women and children lived there too. A baby's shoe, roughly 2,000 years old, told researchers something that centuries of reading Roman military documents had not. And while we are talking about the Romans, there is a letter from Vindolanda, one of the famous Vindolanda tablets, that stops you cold. A soldier stationed on this freezing northern frontier writes home and asks for socks and underwear. That is not military strategy. That is a guy with cold feet asking his family for help. 2,000 years later, it is still the most relatable sentence in all of Roman archaeology. Now, on the other side of the world, shoes were evolving along completely different lines. In China, by the time of the Han Dynasty, roughly 206 BC to 220 AD, silk shoes had become markers of imperial status. The wealthy wore elaborately embroidered silk slippers with thick felt soles, while the working class wore straw sandals or wooden clogs. But it was the practice of foot binding, beginning in the 10th century and lasting roughly 1,000 years, that represents the most extreme intersection of footwear and social control in human history. Young girls' feet were broken and bound to prevent growth, creating a foot roughly 3 to 4 inches long that fit into tiny embroidered lotus shoes. The practice affected an estimated 2 billion women over its history. It was not abolished until the early 20th century. An entire civilization spent a millennium reshaping the human foot to fit a shoe, instead of making a shoe to fit the foot. That is the power of what footwear represents when it stops being about function and becomes entirely about status. In Japan, 2 traditional forms of footwear evolved that solved the problem of wet terrain in a climate with heavy rainfall. The gita, a wooden platform elevated on 2 teeth, kept the foot above mud and puddles. The zori, a flat sandal woven from rice straw, was lighter and more flexible. Both were designed around the same principle: put distance between the foot and the ground. The gita clicked on stone streets the way Roman caligay did, a sound so distinctive that the Japanese developed the word karankoran to describe it, a shoe that named its own sound. Now, if the Romans represent shoes at their most functional, medieval Europe represents shoes at their most absurd. Because at some point in the 14th century, people in Western Europe decided that the way to display wealth and sophistication was to wear shoes with toes so long they could barely walk. The polan, also called the krakow, a shoe with an elongated pointed toe that could extend up to 24 inches beyond the wearer's actual foot. The longer the point, the higher your status. The points were stuffed with moss, wool, or hair to keep them rigid. In extreme cases, they were connected to the wearer's knees with silver or gold chains just to keep them from flopping around. These shoes made walking difficult, running impossible, and any kind of physical labor unthinkable, which was exactly the point. If your shoes are so impractical that you obviously cannot work in them, everyone knows you do not have to. And we know what those shoes did to the people who wore them. In 2021, a team of researchers at the University of Cambridge published a study in the International Journal of Paleopathology examining 177 adult skeletons from 4 cemeteries in and around Cambridge. Between the 11th and 13th centuries, only about 6% of the skeletons showed evidence of hallux valgus bunions. Between the 14th and 15th centuries, the era of the polan, that number jumped to 27%. Among the wealthy, those buried in high-status friary sites, it hit 43%, and the people with bunions were significantly more likely to have fractures from falls. Medieval fashion was literally deforming people's feet and knocking them over. But here's the thing. Even while the poulain was making the human foot miserable, it was also doing something else. It was proving that shoes had become more than protection. They had become communication. A shoe told you who someone was, how much money they had, what class they belonged to, where they stood in the social hierarchy. And that transformation, from survival tool to social signal, is one of the most important things shoes have ever done. Consider what happened next. In 10th century Persia, cavalry soldiers wore heeled boots because the heel locked into the stirrup, letting them stand and fire arrows while riding at full gallop. A functional military innovation. But when Persian diplomats arrived in European courts in the late 1500s, European aristocrats adopted the heel as a fashion statement. King Louis XIV of France, who was not a tall man, wore heels with red soles and mandated that only his inner circle could wear the same color. A military innovation from the Persian steppe became a tool of political control in Versailles. The shoe was doing something no other piece of clothing could. It was literally adding inches to your body, and the added height carried a message. I am above you, and you're not allowed to be as tall as me. Now, here's something most people never think about. For most of human history, there was no such thing as a left shoe and a right shoe. Shoes were made on straight lasts, symmetrical forms that produced identical shoes for both feet. You bought a pair and both shoes were the same shape. To break them in, you soaked them in water and wore them until the leather conformed to one foot or the other. You alternated which foot got which shoe every day to ensure even wear. This was standard practice from roughly 1600 until the mid-1800s. 250 years of wearing shoes that did not acknowledge that your left foot and your right foot are shaped differently. William Young, a cobbler in Philadelphia, is often credited with producing distinct left and right shoes around 1818. But it was not until the 1850s and 1860s, when industrial manufacturing made asymmetrical lasts practical, that left and right shoes became standard for everyone. Think about that. The shoe is at least 40,000 years old. Distinct left and right shoes have existed for roughly 170. For 99.6% of the shoe's history, people just dealt with it. And then came the revolution that changed everything about shoes. Not a design revolution, a manufacturing revolution. Before the late 1800s, every shoe was made by hand. A skilled cobbler could produce maybe a few pairs a day. Shoes were expensive. Many people, particularly the poor, owned one pair or none. And then, in 1883, a young inventor named Jan Ernst Matzeliger, born in Suriname, working in a shoe factory in Lynn, Massachusetts, patented something the industry had tried and failed to automate for decades: the lasting machine. Lasting is the process of stretching the leather upper over the form and attaching it to the sole. It is the most complex and skill-dependent step in shoemaking, and until Matzeliger, it could only be done by hand. A skilled hand laster could produce about 50 pairs in a 10-hour day. Matzeliger's machine could produce between 150 and 700. The patent examiners reportedly needed to see the machine in person because they could not believe it worked from the drawings alone. Matzeliger died of tuberculosis in 1889 at the age of 36. He never saw the full impact of what he built, but his machine did to shoes what the printing press did to books. It made them cheap enough for everyone. Within a generation, shoes went from a luxury to a baseline expectation. Today, the global footwear industry produces roughly 24 billion pairs of shoes a year. That is more than 3 pairs for every human being on Earth. And the machine that made that possible was invented by a man most people have never heard of. And then, in 1839, another accident changed shoes forever. Charles Goodyear, working in Woburn, Massachusetts, accidentally discovered that heating rubber with sulfur created a stable, flexible, durable material. He called the process vulcanization. Before that discovery, natural rubber was nearly useless for footwear. It melted in heat and cracked in cold. After vulcanization, rubber became the perfect sole material: flexible, grippy, waterproof, silent. That last property is the reason you call them sneakers. Rubber soles made no noise on the floor. You could sneak up on someone. The name stuck. By 1916, the U.S. rubber company launched Keds, the first mass-marketed rubber-soled canvas shoe. In 1917, Converse released the All-Star, designed for basketball. And in 1971, a track coach at the University of Oregon named Bill Bowerman, frustrated by the lack of traction on new urethane running surfaces, poured liquid rubber into his wife's waffle iron to see if the grid pattern would make a good sole. It ruined the waffle iron, but the prototype worked. The waffle sole became the foundation of a company called Nike. A breakfast appliance became the template for what is now a $51 billion corporation. Bill Bowerman never got that waffle iron back. Now, here's where the story loops back to something that matters more than sneakers or fashion or billion-dollar brands. Because while we were spending 5,000 years making shoes fancier, taller, pointier, cheaper, and more available, something was happening to our feet. And it was not good. Daniel Lieberman, a professor of biological sciences at Harvard, has spent years studying the biomechanics of barefoot versus shod running. His research comparing habitually barefoot populations in Kenya and Mexico with shoe-wearing populations has found significant differences. Barefoot runners tend to land on the middle or front of the foot. Shod runners, particularly those wearing modern cushioned shoes, tend to land on the heel. That heel strike generates higher impact forces that travel up the leg. Habitually barefoot populations have stronger arches, stronger intrinsic foot muscles, and a lower incidence of certain foot problems. Lieberman is careful to say he does not hate shoes. But his research raises a question that 40,000 years of shoemaking has been quietly producing. The human foot evolved over millions of years to walk and run barefoot. We have spent the last several hundred years encasing it in increasingly rigid, cushioned, elevated structures that do a portion of the foot's job for it. And the foot, denied the work it was designed to do, has responded by getting weaker. We built a tool to protect the foot, and the tool may be slowly changing the foot it was built to protect. So here's the answer. As clearly as the evidence allows, humans did not invent shoes in one place or at one time. The skeletal evidence, specifically the thinning of lesser toe bones analyzed by Eric Trinkhaus, strongly suggests that regular footwear use began roughly 40,000 years ago during the Upper Paleolithic. The oldest surviving footwear, the Fort Rock sandals, dates to roughly 10,000 years ago. The oldest surviving leather shoe, the Areni 1 shoe, dates to roughly 5,500 years ago. But these dates almost certainly represent later examples of a technology that is far older than the surviving objects. Shoes were independently invented in different forms, using different materials, on every inhabited continent in response to the same basic problem. The ground hurts, and your feet are the only part of your body that has to touch it all day. The probability that shoes were a single invention that spread outward from one source is essentially zero. The need was too universal, the materials too varied, the solutions too diverse. Every culture with cold ground, sharp rocks, or thorny terrain arrived at the same conclusion independently because there are only so many ways to solve the problem of a soft foot on a hard world. Tonight, somewhere, a factory is stamping out rubber soles by the thousand. A cobbler in a workshop somewhere is hand-stitching leather the way cobblers have done for centuries. A kid is lacing up sneakers that were designed on a computer, manufactured on 3 continents, and shipped across an ocean in a container vessel. And about 40,000 years ago, in a cave or on a frozen plain, someone wrapped a piece of animal hide around their foot, tied it with a strip of sinew, stood up, and took a step. The ground did not hurt, and they kept walking.